All right. Thank you, Ryan. Welcome, everybody. So my job is to quickly set the stage. I think I know everybody on the call, but for those who might have missed or maybe don't know, I'm Eric Friedman, the director of the Leading by Example program. This is one of a number of webinars that we are undertaking as a follow-up to the release of our Executive Order 594, which was signed by the governor back on April 22nd of this year. This one today is focusing on buildings, specifically on the sections of the order that refer to new construction requirements, as well as language surrounding existing facilities and what that language talks about in terms of decarbonizing and meeting the goals of the order. So let's jump in. I'm going to just spend a couple of quick minutes on the order itself for those of you who may not have heard this or maybe want to hear it again, but I want to move quickly over to Katie to jump into the standards themselves, and then also to Sarah to talk about what DCAM has been doing. And then hopefully there'll be time at the end for us to kind of give you some closing thoughts that we have on where we go from here and what some of the next steps look like. So as I said, the executive order was signed just a couple months ago on Earth Day. This order does fully and completely replace or supersede Executive Order 484. In this order, there are a long list of things, some of which we've talked about previously and we'll talk about today. But at a high level, there are a number of targets that have been established in the order starting in 2025, and for some of them moving out all the way to 2050. There is, as we'll talk about, some standards and language around new construction, as well as existing buildings. There's a fairly large section on our fleets and moving toward zero emission vehicles. And then there's a couple of other sections on some other elements related to renewables and other sustainability issues that we don't spend a lot of time on, but we want to make sure that we address in some way. Next. So this order applies to all executive branch agencies and all public institutions of higher education. The Section 5 requirements for eligibility or entities covered includes those entities as well as the non-revenue vehicles under the MBTA. The vehicle section is not really relevant for today's conversation, but we will be talking about that section on some date to come soon. I can't remember what it is. Next week?
Yep, next Wednesday, the 16th. I'll drop the registration link in the chat.
Okay, perfect. A little bit more specifically, this order does some similar things to the last order for those of you who are familiar with 484, but it does do a couple things that are somewhat different. So first of all, it focuses specifically on emissions coming from fossil fuels, and we'll talk about why in just one sec. Unlike the last order where we really didn't address vehicles, this order focuses on establishing goals for the state fleet to include certain percentages of zero emission vehicles, and it also has some acquisition requirements starting next year. I'll skip over the Mass Lead Plus 2.0 for new construction because we're going to spend a lot of time on that, as well as existing building, decarbonization focus. The order does also do a number of other things. It requires agencies to consider emissions impacts when they are undertaking and doing their capital and master plans. It has some biofuel requirements for both bioheat or heating fuel, as well as for diesel vehicle used in on-road vehicles. And then, as I said, it does mention a number of other issues that we think are important, but don't have specific targets or specific requirements. And these include things like on-site renewables, energy storage, planning for resilience, and a number of other sustainability strategies like water conservation, waste reduction, and sustainable landscaping. Next. So this is the lengthy and data-driven set of targets. There are, excuse me, 5 specific groupings of targets, including reductions in on-site fossil fuels, which go all the way out to 2050, virtual elimination of those on-site fossil fuels that we use, and that includes for both buildings and vehicles. We also have requirements out to 2050 for how many zero-emission vehicles need to be part of the fleet. We have goals for the reduction of fuel oil, petroleum fuel oil consumption, and again, essentially trying to virtually eliminate those fuels by 2030. And then we have some goals associated with energy use intensity. That's an energy use per square foot basis, and then also the number of EV charging stations at state facilities. And Jamie, yes, the baseline for most of these includes the 2004 baseline. You'll note that for the percent of the state fleet that should be zero emission, or the number of EV charging stations, does not have a baseline. Those are just numbers fixed in the year that you actually calculate them. Next. Very quickly, I just want to remind folks that the reason we focus on fossil fuel emissions, as opposed to looking at everything, which would include scope 2 emissions or grid electricity, is that the data shows that just about 3/4 of our emissions reductions that we have seen over the last 15 years or so has come from actually the grid itself reducing the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions associated with the power generation across power plants in the region. What this means is that we have been piggybacking essentially on the emissions reductions associated with the grid getting greener. And so this order really says what we need to focus on are the emissions that are the toughest, but also are the ones that we have directly under our control. This is the natural gas, the oil, the propane, the gasoline, the diesel that we use to fuel our power plants, our buildings, as well as our fleets. Next slide. And so I think this is my last slide, last couple of slides. So we recognize and acknowledge that reducing emissions and meeting the targets that we have set are challenging for state facilities. We know that our state campuses, our state buildings are often situated in large facilities, often campus settings with central power plants, with fairly large and complex distribution systems. Many of our facilities operate 24/7. We have building ages even on the same campuses that are variable. Some of them built recently, some of them are 100 years old. And we also know that in part because of DCAM action, a lot of the equipment that is now in place that is heating our campuses and our facilities are actually relatively new. We did a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years to bring that equipment up to snuff. And so we recognize that it's not the most cost-effective strategy to turn around and replace that equipment yet again. Similarly, on the vehicle side, we know that our fleets are comprised primarily of pickup trucks and vans. We also know that often those vehicles are in our fleets for 8, 10, even 12 years. And so it's going to take some time to wait for those vehicles to be available as electric, as well as to then turn over the entire fleet. We also know that when we plan for things and incorporate long-term capital budgets into our programs and into our projects, we know that there's a long-term horizon for this, several years at least, and oftentimes longer. And so all this together leads us to the recognition that much of our progress is going to take a little bit of time to build up, that we're going to need to plan for that, we're going to need to think ahead, and that what we will presumably see is that by the end of this decade into 2030, we will start to see a significant ramp up in meeting the goals and achieving the progress that we need. Next slide. And I'll end here by just saying that we have been directed by the order, often in concert with DCAM, to develop guidelines and guidance documents for many of the sections in this order. We are working on those as we speak, and actually among the first set of guidelines that will be issued will be related to the new construction standard that we're going to talk about in 1 second. So stay tuned for those. There will be an opportunity for folks to look at those drafts and to provide some comments back to us on the guidelines that we are developing. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Katie to launch into the Mass LEED Plus 2.0 standard for new construction. Take it away, Katie.
Great, thanks, Eric. And as Eric mentioned, we are in the process of developing the guideline for this section. It's section 3 of the executive order. So just sort of to give you all a preview, those of you who are here today kind of will get to see some of what we are working on in terms of that guideline document itself. We will be sharing that with all of our stakeholders, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and would invite all of you to take a look at the guideline. Let us know if there are other questions or clarifications that would be helpful to include. These guideline documents are a great tool for us to be able to update over time as new best practices, new technologies emerge. So we hope these will be really helpful, but also really dynamic and help really guide the implementation of this new executive order. So I'm going to quickly kind of recap what the requirements of the executive order state for both the new construction and existing building sections. And then specifically for the new construction, kind of, as I said, give you a sense of a little more detail and sort of what we mean when we say things like eligible technologies. So Ryan, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So just a reminder that the Massachusetts LEED Plus 2.0 standard applies to both new construction and substantial renovation. We did sort of work with DCAM to scope out what we meant by substantial, and that includes major HVAC, envelope, and internal rehabilitation. And also there's a caveat here that it's construction or renovation happening either for state use or located on state lands. Next. So as the name would suggest, the previous new building standard did include LEED, and we have continued to keep LEED certification as a tenet of this new construction standard. There's now a minimum requirement to meet the silver level or higher. I think that will not be particularly challenging, as you know, the majority of our state LEED buildings right now are gold or platinum. We recently had the 95th state LEED building added. We're doing a fun countdown to 100, but I think beyond the obvious energy-related accolades of LEED certification, there's a lot of value in a number of the non-energy prerequisites as well, including air quality and recycling. And so we just felt that it was important to continue to use the LEED certification as part of the requirements for new construction. Next. So again, this is somewhat similar to the original Mass LEED Plus standard in that there is a requirement that building EUI be 20% better than the current energy code. There are some additional details that the EUI reduction should really focus on the building efficiency rather than just necessarily focusing on strictly renewables. Just because it's new construction, this is really the prime opportunity to address envelope and thermal related aspects. So I think that this is nothing new, but something that is new, Ryan, if you could click through, as the new 2021 climate bill that was signed in March does include a directive that DOER is going to develop a specialized stretch energy code. From our initial discussions with folks at DOER, it sounds like that energy code will have a similar metric to EUI, but really be focused on thermal efficiency of buildings. They will be promulgating that by the end of 2023. I think it's within 18 months of the signature date of that climate bill, and it will be an appendix to the Massachusetts Building Code. So once that is promulgated, that specialized stretch energy code will replace this EUI requirement in the executive order. That is stated in the order itself. We will obviously update the guideline to reflect that change, but just sort of wanted to let folks know that that's what's coming down the pike. Next slide. So as we know, some of the main systems in buildings that we want to focus on decarbonizing, especially in new construction when we have a prime opportunity to do so, relate to the space heating and cooling and water heating. There is language in the order stating that new construction and substantial renovations have to use efficient electric or renewable thermal technologies. And we've had continuous discussions with DCAM and others at DOER and have scoped out sort of what we would like to propose. And Ryan, if you could click. Right now, we are suggesting that prioritizing electrified or non-combustion solutions should be the primary objective, and that those equipment systems should meet the alternative energy portfolio standard specifications for that equipment. And then in cases where those technologies are not feasible for the project, there is an opportunity to seek other APS eligible technologies for renewable thermal, including woody biomass, biofuel, biogas, and compost heat exchange. For water heating systems in buildings, we are suggesting that for new construction, there either be incorporation of efficient electric heat pump water heaters, geothermal, solar thermal, and in certain cases where those sort of centralized water heating systems are not applicable or appropriate that the focus be put on high efficiency electric point of use water heaters. Next. So EUI target setting, I think, is a really key focus area for DCAM and something that they have been working very closely on their projects to ensure that when a building is being designed, that there is a really aggressive EUI target that sort of represents best in class for that building type. So we've codified that in the executive order. And Ryan, if you could click, please. One thing we've added to our draft guideline is that something like the EUI target should be set really early in the design process, and that EUI be based on projects that are very similar in terms of type, size, in the same climate zone, and that there be transparency about how that EUI target was calculated, just so that there is some sort of background information and sort of illustrating how informed that EUI target was. Next. There is a continued focus on on-site renewables and maximizing those whenever possible. In cases where it's not possible, the executive order does state that projects can seek an exemption in that case, but that they must still design the building to be solar ready, which is fully defined in the Massachusetts Building Energy Code. It includes things like running conduit and ensuring that the building's electrical systems are going to be able to handle solar in the future. Ryan, if you could click, please. So really the ideal timing for on-site renewables is going to be during or right after construction. We would recommend an emphasis on solar. It's sort of the best and most natural fit, particularly when you're doing parking areas and rooftops in these new buildings. It's the best time to really get the solar PV installed. As I said, when it's not fiscally or technically feasible for that project, at least seeking to design to be solar ready. And in addition, ensuring that state partners are aware of and adhere to the EPA best practices for making claims about that renewable energy. Next. So climate resilience is an area of growing importance across the state portfolio. Both DCAM and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, as well as many other departments and agencies across state government, have really sort of brought this to the forefront. It involves preparing the physical assets and energy systems to account for projected changes due to climate change and really position the Commonwealth to address those hazards and really reduce the risks. So one thing that we're suggesting in the guideline right now is that projects assess the resilience of sort of the design by using the DCAM resilience checklist. There's also an RMAT climate resilience design tool, both of which that are very helpful in developing designs that will help protect the project from known climate related risks. Next. There is, even though as Eric said, we're not talking about vehicles today, there is a sort of somewhat related electric vehicle tie-in here, just because similar to solar, when you are building these new spaces, typically there will be parking areas, whether those are open or covered parking lots, or if they are parking garages. There is a requirement that depending on the size of that parking area, you install at least 1 or 2 EV charging ports, and that a certain amount of those spaces be EV ready, which is also similar to solar ready, sort of defined further in the Massachusetts Energy Code. Ryan, if you could click. We sort of in our guidelines are expanding a little bit further to talk about how there are multiple use cases for charging, and that there should be a holistic approach taken to sort of decide where stations are sited, sort of the expected future use of those charging stations, and just being cognizant of the expected increased growth of the use of electric vehicles. Again, there's sort of going to be a lot of site-specific elements to this. Level 2 and level 1 chargers are probably the most applicable for most state facilities, with the exception of those that are sort of located right along major roadways, and that projects adhere to any state and federal requirements. We're sort of working on some language in conjunction with the DCAM accessibility initiative folks to ensure we have the right guidance when it comes to accessible EV charging stations, because we do want to ensure that EV charging is available for all. Next. And lastly, there is a provision in the Mass Lead Plus 2.0 standard, as I said, that it sort of qualifies that these standards are also applicable to substantial renovations. If you could click, just sort of recapping how we've tentatively defined that with DCAM, and that projects that are under a certain size threshold, in this case 20,000 square feet, have to meet all of the requirements. They're not required to meet the LEED certification requirement, but it is still strongly recommended, and when possible should still be included as an aspiration as part of the project design process. Next. And then at the end, there are a number of additional directives as part of the standard. These are not requirements, but they're sort of suggested best practices when possible. Ryan, if you could click to the next slide. Right now in the draft guideline document, we've created a few clarifying items and suggestions, just sort of what we mean by each of these additional directives when we're talking about zero net energy. I think it's important to note that as part of that specialized stretch energy code that will be developed and promulgated by DOER, they will be defining a zero net energy building per the Massachusetts Building Code. So we will be updating our guideline to reflect that definition, but I think we are, sort of to be transparent about the renewable energy attributes and claims that can be made. I think the underlying spirit of zero net energy is to optimize the efficiency of the building while also maximizing the energy from renewable resources. So I think that's really what we mean here. It's not necessarily striving to achieve a specific certification. It's really more sort of the underlying premise of the zero net energy concept. When it comes to energy storage, I think it's often a very natural pairing with renewable generation, and the fact that there are a number of incentive programs right now, and that as the grid gets greener and greener, there's going to be a bigger need for battery energy storage to help offset some of those peaks. And so when it makes sense for the site, we would encourage implementation of energy storage. And as part of the site selection process, if that is something that is applicable for a project, considering things like access to public transportation and other modes of transportation, whether that's biking or pedestrians, should be a key part of evaluating the site. And lastly, this is an area that DOER will be exploring further. Per the executive order, we have a directive to conduct some sort of study to do a deeper dive on this, but seeking to reduce embodied carbon in building materials whenever possible. So I think we have some initial technologies out there right now, and when possible, those should be included in projects, but more to come on that in the future. Next slide. So now we'll talk a little bit about existing buildings. This is not a section that we have really done a deeper dive in developing guidance for, so this is really going to be more a summary of the requirements that exist in the order, with the exception of biofuels. When we get there, I will pause, and you'll see that little blue box again to sort of indicate that's the preliminary guidance that we're going to put forth for your comments. Next slide. So there are a number of directives, and I think this is one of the sort of primary focus points of the existing building section, which is section 4 of the executive order, which is that when planning or doing projects that affect energy use, it's really taking the sort of overarching objectives and goals of this executive order into great consideration. So either reducing or eliminating on-site fossil fuel combustion, optimizing building performance, monitoring building energy performance over time to ensure that those buildings are continuing to sort of meet their original objectives, installing the highest efficiency equipment possible, and incorporating energy performance into leasing decisions as well, since we know it's not the vast majority of state square footage, but it is still a piece of it. Next. So planning, and I'll let Sarah speak to some of this in more detail, because really this is DCAM's bailiwick, but Ryan, if you could click through utilizing the energy data, we have quite a wealth of it at this point, and as the CEI, the real-time metering program, continues to roll out and expand, we will have more and more data at our fingertips, which is great, and we're always finding new ways to analyze and leverage that to inform projects in progress. Next. As we said, including things like greenhouse gas emission reductions, decarbonization, clean energy in all types of equipment replacement and capital and master planning. And lastly, DCAM, per the executive order, is directed to conduct periodic analyses, some of them on a 5-year timetable, some of them on a 10-year timetable, just to assess where in the portfolio emissions are still in need of extra support and how we can sort of drive that down. Next. Renovations and comprehensive energy projects is sort of a similar theme here, but again, encompassing the spirit of really seeking to decarbonize whenever possible. I think as Eric spoke to earlier, really the existing building portfolio is really in need of attention, I think, to meet these 2025 through 2050 goals, and sort of seeking out envelope improvements, reducing EUI, increasing the amount of renewable energy and energy storage, and maximizing resiliency. These are all going to be continually important aspects of our building portfolio. And so the order, again, is just sort of weaving all of this into various aspects of our existing building activity. Next. In terms of operations, we will continue to track energy performance and seek to reduce building energy use through operational efficiencies. I think similar to what the previous order did, there's a directive to continue to provide training and professional development, and that is something that DCAM and MAFMA already do to a great degree and very effectively. And so again, this executive order just sort of codifies the great work that's already happening and enables them to continue it going forward. Next. Heating oil, as Eric alluded to, this is one where there's an effective date of July 1st. So there will be a guideline document on heating oil as well, actually coming out at around the same time as that new construction guideline. We will be accepting comments. Basically, for sites that are using heating oil, there's going to be a new B10 biofuel blend minimum requirement. And Ryan, if you could click through. The B100 portion of that fuel must meet the APS requirements. So we'll have more details and information in the guideline, and would love to get your feedback on this, particularly those of you that still have some measure of heating oil use at your sites, just to make sure that the information and guidance we're providing is helpful and helps you address any questions you might get. Next. There's leasing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this piece, but again, this is something that sort of falls in DCAM's purview, and I know they've already had many active discussions on sort of how they can incorporate these types of requirements and considerations into new leases moving forward. Next. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Katie. I think we're a small group here on the live audience. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Creighton, and I work across DCAM on climate action planning. And we've been taking climate action seriously for many years with decades of energy efficiency projects. The focus on climate action has become more intense in the last several years, and it's really an all-agency effort. And we've been measuring our progress both in aggregate and on a building by building and a project by project basis, taking steps to build for the future and also working to accelerate our progress. We worked very closely with DOER on the development of this order, and I think some of you may feel that it looks quite familiar to the prior executive order. But the real focus here, we clarified a bunch of things in the order, I think, and the real focus here, as Eric and Katie said, is fossil fuel reduction, which is a kind of a new focus. Go ahead, Ryan. So this is just a slide that summarizes the new buildings and substantial renovation requirements that Katie just went through. And the point is here that we are at DCAM with our new, and we do most new buildings for the Commonwealth. We are really already doing these things in most of our new buildings already. And so this is going to be more of the same and learning from projects and doing it better as we go along. Go ahead. So an example of that is the Mass Bay Community College Health Sciences Center with a very low target EUI of 30, a high performance building envelope. And we focused on fossil fuel free, moving toward a zero energy on net basis building with selecting clean fuels and a resilient building for the future. Go ahead. Our EUI, we're always trying to drive that down in a practical way. The order asks us to be 20% better than code, and the guidance and the order specify some ways to actually what that really means. And then to use best in class EUI as a focus. And just to remind everybody that EUI is the kBTUs per square foot, and the lower number is more efficient. It's a good measure of energy efficiency, although it is not specific to where those BTUs come from. We're looking to try to have them come from non-fossil fuel sources. This chart shows progress. As most of you know, EUI is specific to building use and type as well as hours of use. You can't compare necessarily across all these buildings and say Bunker Hill is better than Cape Cod or something, because they're different building types. But nonetheless, these are all really aggressive energy use intensity targets or achieved results. Go ahead. So our plan asks us to accelerate this progress, and the order asks that we do best in class EUI. What we do is try to compare to other similar building types in Massachusetts if we have the data, and we have pretty robust data, and to not just this chart shows both state buildings as well as other courts that are non-Massachusetts courts, and the arrow shows a target for a building that is now on hold, but it was in planning when we developed this chart. What we find is that some of the national data sets aren't that useful because they include older buildings which aren't as aggressive. And a caution, if anybody on the call is not working with DCAM, in particular, the baselines for the AIA 2030 targets are much higher, some of which don't meet mass energy codes, so a little caution there. Okay, go ahead. Here are just some of our projects where we've used low carbon fuels with a caution. Natick Readiness Center generates solar energy, but sells the renewable energy attributes, but at a savings to the facility. Chelsea's Soldiers Home uses ground source heat pumps and will host solar PV. There's biomass at 9 state sites with a new biomass boiler at DYS Connolly. And the power purchase agreement for hosted solar at Bristol Community College is one of the largest solar parking lot canopies in New England. So all of these have offered low carbon solutions to the region and operational savings to the agency. Okay, go ahead. Of course, existing buildings is the real challenge. I mean, it's all challenging, right? But existing buildings is really a challenge, and the order is more directive than the prior order in this area. And in particular, 2 areas in particular, we'll be asked to have our teams evaluate the building envelope and upgrade it where feasible, in addition, of course, to targeting a low energy use intensity, but also to evaluate low carbon solutions for heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. Now, evaluating the envelope, the rationale here is simple. The envelope is a driver of energy efficiency, and if we're going to change out our HVA systems to be low carbon, the smaller we can make them, the better in terms of the smaller they can be in terms of load. They are less expensive to build and to operate. In terms of evaluating low carbon HVAC, that has to happen really early in any project, and we'll be pushing our teams. An aside is that as we're moving to incorporate this into our RFPs, as well as our new house doctor relationships. We're meeting with house doctors to talk with them about this expectation. It's been implied throughout Eric's and Casey, Katie's comments, but bears repeating that one of the assumptions that we're all operating under is that the electric grid in the region has been getting cleaner for sure, and will continue to get cleaner and lower carbon. So we're going to be moving largely to electrification. Okay, go ahead. Many of you on this call know that there are a number of decarbonization studies that have either almost complete, or in process at the UMass facilities, as well as the Salem State North Campus, and an integration of a decarbonization plan with the master plan at Mass Maritime. The executive order does have planning requirements, as Katie mentioned. And at DCAM, we're looking to include decarbonization into master plans, facility conditions assessments, and critical infrastructure planning. And the results of all of these studies show that we need to move to a low temperature water distribution, which is largely accommodates a heat pump technology. And then to do that successfully, we need to make our buildings ready with higher efficiency, appropriate heat delivery and air conditioning delivery equipment, and then to transition to electric infrastructure. And we're also looking to think about how do we future-proof our facilities, even if we can't fully undertake the decarbonization in a given project. Go ahead. And lastly, I'll just say that, again, Eric alluded to this, there are many challenges. Among them is that we have central plants that serve multiple buildings, and many of those have natural gas systems that they're not always new, but they're generally often have been converted from oil, so they're relatively new. The infrastructure and the building envelopes can be expensive and disruptive to a campus to retrofit, and the need to ready the buildings. This is not a plug and play solution in most cases. So this is going to be an integrated set of solutions here. And we'll be working with all of you to address these going forward. Okay, turn it back to you, Katie or Eric.
All right, so I think it's just back to me quickly. Just a couple of closing thoughts, and then we want to leave time for questions, clarifications, or other points that folks want to make. The next just couple of slides are just our initial thoughts on helping folks to think about how do we get off our chairs and start thinking about this now, while these longer planning efforts for full decarbonization are taking place kind of in a longer time frame. So let's go to the next slide. So I think we want to just start by just reminding folks that the reason we have such a big focus on buildings in this executive order is some of the data here that shows that buildings comprise well over 3/4, 85% actually, of the state's emissions that come from fossil fuels. So that means obviously that if we're going to achieve these goals in any measure, we have to be looking at our building portfolio and the building sector within the state system. Additionally, as Sarah mentioned, there has been a huge effort to transition to natural gas as the transition fuel that we used to call a number of years ago. And so when we look at our on-site fossil fuel emissions, 90% of those are actually coming from, in the building sector, 90% of those are coming from natural gas. So when you hear efforts, at DCAM and in other places focusing on converting away from natural gas in our building sectors used for heating, this is exactly why the conversation almost immediately goes to that fuel and to this sector. And then I want to just quickly, next slide, thanks to Chelsea for pulling together this data. Just wanted to point out that when we look at our building portfolio, that the existing building portfolio is really where the work needs to happen. This is data just from the last 15 or 16 years, and it really just shows that, again, the vast majority of buildings in place now are existing, and only small portions of our portfolio get replaced over time. We also recognize that a lot of the new construction that's happened over the last number of years is likely to slow down as the state focuses on managing and taking care of its existing square footage, and kind of puts a bit of a hold on new construction, although there definitely are some new construction and new buildings coming online. But we certainly don't necessarily think that this will happen at the same pace over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And so again, here's some thoughts. There's no magic bullet to this. And so we want to help folks kind of think about this in a way that doesn't overwhelm you from the get-go, because this can be overwhelming when we talk about achieving the goals that we want to achieve. So first, we just want to remind folks that decarbonization is not happening all at once. It is something that is going to take time. It's going to take all of us working together. It's going to take planning. It's going to take budgets. It's going to take adoption of new technology. So this is a process, and we just need to acknowledge and accept that this will take time. The second thing we want to encourage people to think about is, even though you may not be able to see the opportunity to get rid of fossil fuels tomorrow or next week or next year, what we want to encourage you to think about is to not do the opposite, right? So we call this sort of do no harm. We're kind of stealing from the medical profession. And what we're saying here is, even though we can't necessarily see a clear pathway immediately to getting rid of fossil fuels, what we don't want to do is increase the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning at our site. So if we're building new buildings, if we're doing additions, if we're renovating, what we do at a minimum, what we want to avoid is creating new dependence for decades to come on fossil fuels. And so we want to avoid that at all costs. We also want to encourage people to think about reasonable risks. We recognize that we are the public sector and that sometimes what we do is under a microscope, but there are some pretty significant goals that the governor has set for the entire state. I think we didn't talk about that in the beginning, but I think everybody knows that the state is under some very, very rapid and aggressive timelines to reduce and eliminate emissions across the entire Commonwealth. And so we, as in our leading by example role, I think need to figure out ways to demonstrate opportunities and to, again, adopt some risks that may be appropriate to try and lead the way toward meeting the goals that the governor has set. When we think about cost, it's pretty overwhelming. A lot of the equipment replacement and infrastructure replacement can have hefty price tags associated with these efforts. But I think we want to encourage folks to think about, first of all, that these are often investments. We are moving away from equipment that will continually become older and less efficient. And so we are now investing in new equipment and in new systems that will be more efficient and hopefully less costly to operate over time. And that secondly, that these investments do not have to happen all at once. I don't think we should be thinking about finding $20 million tomorrow or $50 million or $100 million, whatever our site, whatever it's going to cost, and just finding that in one lump sum. We need to think about, as we've talked about, incorporating some of these investments into the work that we're already doing. So if we have capital projects, if we're doing master planning, we think about how can we move the needle using existing resources and existing funds and existing programs. Last couple things here, don't reinvent the wheel. There are studies out there on decarbonization. There are campuses and agencies that are thinking really creatively. DCAM is doing a tremendous amount of work thinking about decarbonization. So it is not all up to you at your facilities. There are others out there who are thinking about this, and it's really important that you learn from them and that we all also work to share the information and experiences that we have. And then lastly on this, just want to say that there are, in fact, resources out there and potential resources that will hopefully be coming as state policy shifts toward this much more aggressive set of actions that need to happen to decarbonize. So whether it's the social cost of carbon getting embedded into new mass save programs, the transportation climate initiative happening for the transportation sector within the next couple of years. Other incentives that we don't even know about coming out of the state for renewable thermal potentially. These are all ways in which we can hopefully mitigate some of the costs associated with this work. So next, much too busy slide. This will be in the slide that gets sent out to you, but these are just sort of a little bit more detail and a reiteration of some of the things we just said. Ways of sort of thinking about, decarbonization, building electrification. If electrification doesn't work, switching to other less carbon intensive fuels, and then also always thinking about energy efficiency in whatever work we're doing. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we can probably stop sharing the slides and open it up for additional thoughts, questions, comments.